Thanks for inviting me. Happy 50th birthday. And I just want to tell you, I'm glad that you're younger than I am. I have 3 take-home messages to tell you about today, but I really want to tell you before that about the genesis of this talk. I decided that I wanted to have a conversation. I wanted to present some ideas so people would listen, we wouldn't be distracted by slides, and I would look forward to questions and answers, and that I would really make an invitation during the talk so that people would listen to me and be attracted to me. And then I got anxious because I thought that everybody in the panel would have PowerPoint and what would happen. So I called my psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, you know, you have to do what you have to do, and you have to think very carefully about decisions, and every decision is grave, and there's import to it, and you really have to give this some thought. Then I spoke to my wife, and she said, everybody's going to have a PowerPoint, and if you don't have a PowerPoint, you're not going to know what to say, and you're going to start to ramble and go off speed, so you should have a PowerPoint. So my wife frightened me and made me anxious. And so yesterday I made this PowerPoint, and it was succinct, it was beautiful, it had some pictures, it was just gorgeous. And when I looked at my USB this morning, it wasn't there. So I called my psychiatrist, and my psychiatrist said, you really didn't want to give a PowerPoint. And then I spoke to my wife, and she said, you never listened to me. So my 3 take-home messages are these. The NIDDK apologizes, your institute, your research institute at NIH, because we're late to patient engagement. The NIDDK, however, unfortunately, is in a leadership role at NIH regarding patient engagement. I was recently at a multi-institute conference, and the only institute that was ahead of NIDDK was the Cancer Institute. So I was gratified by that. I understand that we have a long way to go. I particularly am a Johnny-come-lately. I learned about patient engagement to solve some specific research administrative problems, and I'll tell you about that in the next 10 minutes. But the third message is NIDDK now is deeply and firmly involved in patient engagement at all levels. And I liked what Dr. Madros said about the review process where patients are involved in all levels. That's the way we want to do research involving human beings at NIDDK, that they should be involved at all levels. And just to tell you about the importance of this at NIDDK, my organization, we have a council meeting 3 times a year. It's like the board of directors. And Richard Knight, your president, applaud. That's enough, that's enough. We only have 10 minutes. And representatives of the diabetes community and the GI community are all going to give talks to the council, to the whole NIDDK, to scientists, to administrators, talking about the importance of patient engagement and talking about what their organizations are doing regarding patient engagement. So that's a tremendous commitment on the part of a big research bureaucratic institution. It also means at the end of this discussion, I'm going to ask all of you to participate. We're starting some new research programs, and I'm going to be consulting with the leadership of AAKP to find patients who can provide their voice to researchers, say to speak truth to power. So we've had several big studies within NIDDK, the MDRD study, the study of diet and blood pressure control in patients, the ASK study, the African American study of kidney disease, and the chronic renal insufficiency cohort. The ASK study had no patient engagement, studies from the 80s. The MDRD study had no patient engagement. Doesn't mean we were bad people, it's just the ethos of the time didn't include that kind of idea. The CRIC study is 18 years old, and they're being pushed by NIDDK now to put patients on all their committees, to empower the patients who are giving them the data that they're going to use, and I think we're succeeding. So how did I get involved in patient engagement? I'm probably the leading advocate of patient engagement right now in NIDDK, and I'm very proud of that. But I didn't do it because somebody told me to initiate patient engagement. We had a study that I was involved in where we were going to ask patients to be volunteers where they may be at some risk. And you may have heard about the KPMP study, the Kidney Precision Medicine Project. I'll be speaking about that at a lunch table this afternoon. And that project is because we have made, although we've made some advances, we haven't made fundamental advances in understanding acute renal failure or acute kidney injury and understanding CKD. So we have some treatments. We have very effective treatments in terms of blood pressure control, interruption of the renin-angiotensin axis with CKD. In AKI, we have really not made much progress at all, and our feeling scientifically is we don't really understand the pathways, we don't understand the mechanisms, we don't understand what drug targets should be used. And after several workshops, which involved patients, which involved scientists, the answer sort of emerged that if you don't have biopsies, if you don't have human tissue that you can put under a microscope, that you can smash the electrons of, that you can do all kinds of atomic analyses, omics you may have read about in the newspapers and magazines, you're not going to understand how to treat the disease fundamentally. But when you do a renal biopsy on a patient who usually doesn't need a renal biopsy but has a kidney disease, there's some risk. Between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 8,000 patients will die as a result of that procedure. So that's a tremendous ask. It's a very small risk. It's like the risk of a tonsillectomy, but it's a risk that wouldn't be undergone otherwise. And when we struggled with how we were going to start a research project, we started a workshop. And in this workshop, I said, we're going to have 4 or 5 patients in this workshop talking to us, listening to us, responding to us, being on the committees to tell us how they felt about it. Was it reasonable to ask for this kind of renal biopsy program? And we had some members of the AAKP leadership. We had one of my patients from GW participate. And along with ethicists, with members of the FDA, and with scientists at the NIH, the conclusion was it's ethical to go forward and do these kinds of biopsies with patients participating in the research if the patients are informed, if the patients know what the risks are, and if the patients, the participants, are willing to do that and are eager to participate in the study for altruistic reasons, not because they're going to benefit, but because future generations will benefit. The most important participants in those discussions were not the FDA, were not the ethicists, and were not the scientists, but were the patients who said, I would have a biopsy again if I knew that it could be involved in a cure. And it's an incredibly important voice in government documents and sterile documents when we say we had 6 patients who endorsed this program. So what we did was we set out in the government, it's called an RFA, or Request for Applications. And in the application, we said, you want $500,000 to do these tests? Great, write a very scientific application, but on your team, you have to have 2 patients. You don't have 2 patients, we're not going to consider your application. Very good science, no patients, no good. So at our first meeting, we had 100 scientists, and we had 15 patients in a room just like this. And I led off the meeting, and I said, look, I know there are patients here. You know, you may not feel well, you know, across the course of a day. You may only want to attend 2 hours of a session. You may not want to spend 8 hours in a medical meeting like I do because I love it. I understand. You want to go visit the Washington Monument, that's fine. You want to stay in the hotel room, have a nap, you know, from 10 to 2, that's great. Don't worry about it. I have been shocked because at these KPMP meetings, almost all the patients stay in the meeting all day because A, they want to know what's going on scientifically, B, they want to tell the scientists what they think, and I'm one of the leaders, and I encourage those patients to call the scientists on any aspect you want. What did you mean when you say the X, Y, Z, the LE, right? What does that mean? It's perfectly acceptable behavior. And we want the patients to ask questions and to be involved. And the patients have turned out to be as important participants as the scientists. So sort of what you were saying, Dr. Modrow, we're having the patients at all levels of the interaction. So I was personally surprised by that. What did the patients do in the KPMP? They wrote the first draft of the informed consent document. Nobody likes to sign those informed consent documents. They're 60 pages long. They have lawyers' stamps. They have all these things. You can't even read them. You can't understand them. So the patient said, we want a one-page document. Everybody said, that's great. Then when the patients had to work with the IRBs, and the IRB said, no, we need 6, 7 pages, they understood the reality of creating that document. I think it was important for us and important for the patients. But I think that when you say to a regulatory body, a data safety monitoring board, an IRB, this is the way we want to do the study because the patients were involved with us from the very beginning. The patients wrote this informed consent. That has tremendous heft. And just to tell you what happened in KPMP, how many of you have signed an informed consent document for a research thing with a hospital, right? There's that little paragraph that says, if you're injured in this study, the George Washington University won't pay 1 single penny for you, right? You remember that little line? It's in all the informed consent forms because it's part of the language that the hospital wants. They don't want to be involved in committing to pay for care out of a research study. Now, of course, they would have to do that if it happened, but legally they didn't want to. The NIDDK worked with the investigators so that we spoke with the deans, the CEOs of the hospitals, the heads of the IRB, and said, would you like to have the $500,000 of grant money? Would you like to participate in this research? They all said yes. Well, if you don't take that clause out, you can't play. And isn't it amazing? Every one of those big national hospitals, they knuckled under. So because there were patients in the KPMP, the United States informed consent process and the relationship between hospitals and patients in research studies has fundamentally changed forever. And that was a dramatic thing. It just happened in August, and I'm very proud of playing a role in that with patients. Patients participate in the DSMB. Patients participate in the EEP. Paul Conway is one of the EEP members, and he keeps us very honest. He's quite eloquent. He says, I may not understand some of the details about the omics, but here's what you have to do about communication and respect. It's very powerful. What does EEP? EEP means the External Expert Panel. So it's a regulatory group within the study. But as Dr. Modrow said, patients are involved at every level, from the design to the regulation. So that's very exciting. I'll tell you briefly about the Apollo study. Mr. Knight talked about this very, very early in the session. It's a study of looking at how genetics may affect transplant outcomes in kidneys donated by African Americans. So because we had started to use this language where there were patients called for in each one of the sites, we had that in the RFA. When we brought the research group together in Bethesda 2 years ago, it was really amazing. All the investigators were white. All the patients and participants in the prospective study was black. This looked terrible to me, and it looked terrible to the leadership of the NIDDK. What were we going to do in such a case? Well, luckily, I had put this clause in the RFA saying each site had to appoint 2 patients who had a personal relationship with transplantation or kidney disease. Suddenly, we had a council of 26 African Americans involved in the study from the very, very beginning. And they talked with the investigators. They did the same kind of thing they did in KPMP. They talked about language that they didn't like in the informed consent, language that they liked in the informational materials, tips about how to approach patients, tips about how to be culturally sensitive, and it made it a much better study. So I think that the Community Advisory Council has done a wonderful job, and we have Patrick G. and Glenda Roberts in the room who are on that council, and if I said anything that's wrong, you tell me and you tell the audience. They're quiet now. You can give them some applause. They've done a wonderful job on that council. Not only that, but patients serve on the steering committee. Nicole Jefferson, who I think many of you know, is a steering committee member. So she's as important as the NIDDK, as the steering committee chair, as all the scientists who are in this study. And we take what she says seriously. So when our EEP, that external panel, went and reviewed some of the things that we wanted to do with return of results, a very hot topic, the patients had said they wanted to have a variable return of results policy. Some people want to know their genetics. Some people don't want to know their genetics. So the EEP didn't like that. And what the response was this was developed by the patients. And so we overruled the EEP, and the patients specifically wrote to the EEP saying, if you want to see what we function as, come to one of our meetings. You're invited. They never came. I'll tell you about 2 other studies, and then I'll wrap up. We're just starting the HOPE study. It's a study of patients on hemodialysis who are receiving opioid prescriptions. It turns out that 20% of American dialysis patients receive more than 90 days of opioid prescriptions. We're just starting this study in 2 weeks. Patients will be at that meeting. Dr. Schmidt, I'm expecting patients from West Virginia to come to that meeting. Don't tell me they won't be able to come. Don't tell me they won't be able to be dialyzed in Washington, D.C. I took down the stuff from the front of the AAKP saying who to call, DeVita and Fresenius, to make your appointments so you can have dialysis in D.C. And patients will be on the DSMB, the Data Safety Monitoring Board. They'll be part of the regulation. We had a workshop on acute kidney injury in January of this year in Bethesda. We specifically invited patients. They were on a panel like this. We gave the patients 2 hours to tell their stories. When we started the meeting, all the doctors said, what are we going to look for when we do an acute renal failure study? Well, we're going to look what the creatinine is, and we're going to look what the protein is, and we're going to look what the CPK is, and we're going to look what the, whatever it is. At the end of the meeting, the physicians changed to say, we're going to look at the end of the study with patient satisfaction with care, patient quality of life, patient function, and patient ability to cope with disease. Not only was that a great achievement for patients, but my peers listening to this discussion said, oh my God, we would have never come up with a patient-centered view of it. That's the way to go. That's what's important. So that's how patients can help. I want to just mention the Kidney Health Initiative, which I've learned a lot from watching all the patients participate in that group, which is co-sponsored by the ASN and the FDA, and noting that the FDA has done a tremendous job putting patients on their panels, listening to their voices. It's fundamental. So now patient engagement is key for NIDDK. It's going to be part of our council meeting. We will have, in general, I've spoken at NIDDK, I think we will have a patient voice involved in all our requests for research, in all our cooperative agreements, in all our clinical trials, in all our oversight groups, and in all our workshops. So, just to summarize, patient engagement, NIDDK is new to this effort, but we have embraced it wholeheartedly. I personally became involved in this serendipitously. It was on-the-job training for me. But now, I think this is the most important thing that I've done in NIDDK over the last 5 years. And when people ask me officially, that's what I say, and they don't complain too much. NIDDK is committed to patient engagement right now and for the future. And as part of this commitment, we're going to call on you. I'm going to speak to Richard Knight and Paul Conway about patients who would like to participate in the HOPE study as consultants and as members of DSMBs, and I do hope you will serve. So patient engagement has changed my life. I will give you one caveat. It's very hard to evaluate scientifically whether it makes a difference in outcomes or anything, but I feel amazing power in such relationships that I never felt before in a study. So I can't give you the results of an RCT, I can't give you a p-value, I can't give you standard deviations and a 12.5 plus or minus 1.2, but I think it's made a big, big difference, and I hope you will contribute. Organizations like this are fundamental to federal agencies. So I want to say thank you, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions when we get to that period.